The smell of motor oil still lingers in my memory like the ghost of everything I've lost and everything I've gained. My name is Daniel Wright, and this is the story of how I went from being the forgotten son to the man who rebuilt an empire from its ashes, only to discover that victory tastes different than I had imagined. It started on a Tuesday, one of those relentless summer days when the heat makes the pavement shimmer and the air in the garage sits thick enough to chew. I was bent over Mrs. Kowalski's Buick, replacing a fuel pump for the third time that month, when my father's shadow fell across my work. Office now. His voice had that particular edge, the one that meant Jason had screwed up again, and I was about to clean up the mess. I wiped my hands on a rag that had been white sometime last decade and followed him through the maze of half-dismantled cars. The office was exactly as it had been since Grandpa's day. Yellowed posters of pinup girls with vintage cars, a coffee pot that had brewed every terrible decision our family ever made, and the ancient desk where my father now sat like a judge about to deliver a death sentence. "We're done, Danny." He pushed a stack of papers toward me. Bank notices, overdue invoices, a foreclosure warning. The numbers swam before my eyes. 3 months of operating costs, a mountain of debt, and a single line that stood out like a scream. $28,750 in business expenses charged to Jason's company card last quarter alone. I looked up to find my father staring at his hands. Those massive, grease-stained hands that could rebuild an engine blindfolded, but couldn't seem to grasp basic math. "The bank's calling the loan next week," he said quietly. 30 years, Danny. Gone. The shop phone rang. I knew without answering it would be another customer complaining about Jason's half-assed repairs. I'd spent the last year quietly fixing his mistakes, knowing Dad would never call him out. Jason was the golden child, the charismatic one who could sweet-talk customers while secretly botching their transmissions. That night in my apartment above the shop, the same cramped space I'd lived in since high school, I spread the books across my kitchen table. The numbers told a brutal truth. Wright and Sons wasn't dying. It was being murdered. By dawn, I traced every dollar Jason had bled from the business. The supplier meetings at strip clubs, the company car he'd totaled drunk driving, the fake invoices he'd created to cover his tracks. The evidence filled 3 notebooks. I confronted Dad at opening time. He listened in silence, his face growing older with each page I turned. When I finished, he did the one thing I hadn't expected. He laughed. "Jesus, Danny, you really think this matters?" He gestured at the shop around us. "This place has been dying since your grandfather's stroke. Jason's just having fun before the end." The words hit me like a thrown wrench. All those years of loyalty, of covering for Jason, of pretending I didn't notice Dad's proud smile whenever my brother walked into a room, none of it had ever mattered. Something inside me broke that morning. Not dramatically, but quietly, like a timing belt snapping on the highway. I started with Mr. Kowalski. The old man had been coming to our shop since before I was born. When I showed up at his door with his repaired Buick and the truth about our finances, he surprised me by writing a check on the spot. "For you, kid. Not for that waste of space brother of yours." One by one, I visited every loyal customer. I didn't beg. I simply showed them the work I'd actually done on their cars, the repairs Jason had faked, the corners he'd cut. By month's end, I'd secured enough prepaid service contracts to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, Jason kept spending. I let him. Every receipt, every forged signature, every lie, I documented them all in a locked file cabinet. The angrier Dad got about my betrayal, the more reckless Jason became. The turning point came when I found Jason trying to pawn shop equipment to cover gambling debts. Dad walked in as I was confronting him. For one heartbeat, I thought maybe, finally, he'd see the truth. Instead, he slapped me. "Family sticks together," he growled, while Jason smirked behind him. That night, I sat in my apartment with 2 glasses of whiskey, one for me, one for the father I just lost. The next morning, I walked into First National Bank with 3 years of evidence and a business plan for Wright Automotive. Mrs. Wilkins, the loan officer who'd known me since I was 12, studied my paperwork for a long time. "You realize," she said finally, "this will destroy your family." I met her gaze without blinking. "They destroyed themselves. I'm just cleaning up the wreckage." The loan approval came through the following week. I didn't tell Dad. I waited until the day Jason came to work with a black eye and another fake invoice. That's when I handed my father the keys to the shop and walked out without looking back. The bell jingled behind me one last time. Somewhere in the distance, a car backfired like a gunshot. I didn't know it then, but the war was just beginning. The first 90 days after leaving Wright & Sons nearly broke me. I'd rented a derelict gas station on the south side of town, a crumbling brick building with garage doors that groaned when opened, and plumbing that spat brown water for the first 30 seconds every morning. The grand opening sign I'd painted myself hung crooked over the entrance, the red letters bleeding in the spring rain. I woke up that first Monday to find Jason's friends had paid me a visit overnight. "Traitor," spray-painted across the roll-up doors. All 4 tires on my loaner truck slashed, a crude drawing of me with a noose around my neck. I was scrubbing off the last of it when my first customer arrived, Mr. Kowalski in his ancient Buick, just like I'd promised. "Took me 20 minutes to find this damn place," he grumbled, tossing me his keys. "You better make it worth my while, kid." By noon, 6 more cars had pulled in, all longtime Wright & Sons customers. None of them mentioned the vandalism, though Old Man Peterson discreetly left a can of paint remover by my tools. That first week, I worked 18-hour days, falling asleep under cars and waking up with a transmission fluid in my hair. Every ache felt like victory. The calls started in week 3. First from suppliers confused about why I'd opened separate accounts. Then from former Wright & Sons employees asking if I was hiring. Most surprising was the call from Jessica Morales, Jason's ex-girlfriend and the best mechanic our family shop had ever employed. "He fired me for refusing to falsify inspection records," she told me over coffee at the diner across from my shop. Her knuckles were scraped raw. She'd punched Jason on her way out. "I've got 3 guys who'll walk out with me if you've got the space." I didn't, but I leased the vacant lot next door that afternoon. By month 2, Wright Automotive had a skeleton crew and a waiting list 2 weeks long. Meanwhile, downtown Wright & Sons was crumbling. I'd drive by sometimes and count the empty bays. 3 in April, 5 by May. My father's once proud sign now hung crooked, "The & Sons" flickering erratically where the neon tubing had cracked. The confrontation came on a humid June night. I was elbows deep in a diesel engine when the familiar squeal of Jason's Camaro announced his arrival. He kicked open the office door so hard the glass shattered. "You little shit," he spat, his breath reeking of bourbon. "You're stealing our customers." I wiped my hands slowly, buying time to assess his condition. Bloodshot eyes, shaking hands, the beginnings of a bruise along his jawline, probably from Dad. This wasn't just anger, this was desperation. "They came to me, Jason, just like your best mechanic did, like your suppliers are about to." I reached under the counter and slid a folder toward him. "Recognize these?" His face went pale as he flipped through the documents. forged work orders, fake invoices, even the police report from when he'd hit that minivan while driving drunk last year. All the evidence I'd quietly collected over the years. You wouldn't. The bell above the door jingled. Jessica walked in with two of our new hires, both former Wright and Sons employees. They didn't say a word, just crossed their arms and stared at Jason with open contempt. "I'm giving you a choice," I said quietly. "Walk out of here, tell Dad you're getting clean. And maybe you save what's left of his shop. Or keep fighting me and I release all of this to the bank, the police, and the local news." Jason's hands trembled as he stared at the documents. For a fleeting moment, I saw the brother who'd taught me to change tires when I was 12. Then his face twisted into something ugly, and he hurled the folder against the wall, papers exploding like confetti. "You always were a sanctimonious little bastard," he hissed before storming out, his tires spitting gravel across the lot. Jessica helped me gather the scattered papers. "You know he's not going to change, right?" I stared at the fading taillights. "I know." The real blow came 3 weeks later. A sheriff's deputy delivered the notice. Wright and Sons was being sued by the family whose minivan Jason had hit. The settlement would bankrupt them. That night, I sat in my office staring at Dad's number on my phone until the screen went dark. I didn't make the call. Instead, I drove to the old shop at dawn. The foreclosure notice was already taped to the door. Through the grimy windows, I could see my father sitting at his desk, motionless in the half-light. The once bustling shop was eerily silent, most of the equipment already repossessed. Only the antique sign remained. Wright and Sons since 1947. The bell jingled when I entered. Dad didn't look up. "I suppose you're here to gloat." I set 2 coffees on the desk. One black, one with 3 sugars like he'd always taken it. "I'm here to make an offer." His bloodshot eyes met mine for the first time in months. "What could you possibly want from this wreck?" "Not the debt, not the equipment." I slid a key across the desk. "Just the name. And the land." He laughed bitterly. "You want to buy your own inheritance?" "No," I said, opening the folder I'd brought. "I want to buy my future." The numbers didn't lie. My offer would cover his debts and leave enough for a modest retirement. More than the bank would give him. More than he deserved. Dad's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Jason's not part of this deal?" "Not even a little." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the ancient wall clock. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the depth of his soul, he reached for the pen. I expected to feel triumph when I walked out with the signed papers. Instead, all I felt was the weight of that broken neon sign and Sons. As I pulled it down for the last time. The foreclosure auction was set for the first Tuesday in October. I arrived early, coffee in hand, and watched from across the street as the bank representatives arranged their clipboards. The morning air carried the scent of oil and rust from the decaying shop that had been my family's legacy. My legacy now. I didn't expect my father to show up, but there he was, standing stiffly by the boarded-up office door in his only suit. The same one he'd worn to my high school graduation. We hadn't spoken since signing the papers 3 months earlier. When our eyes met across the parking lot, he gave the slightest nod before turning away. The bidding started lower than I'd anticipated. The property's location and environmental concerns scared off most investors. My first offer was $50,000 under my maximum budget. The auctioneer's monotone chant filled the humid air as I methodically raised my paddle, outbidding the single competing offer from a commercial developer. Going once, going twice. A commotion at the back of the crowd made the auctioneer pause. Jason came barreling through, face flushed, waving a cashier's check like a winning lottery ticket. "I have $200,000 right here," he shouted. "The Wright family is buying back our shop." The auctioneer looked to the bank representative, who shook her head. "Mr. Wright, your name appears on the exclusion list due to outstanding judgments. You're not a qualified bidder." Jason's face purpled. "This is bullshit. That's my fucking name on that building." He turned wild eyes toward me. "You did this. You planned this whole thing." I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse hammered in my throat. This moment, this exact scenario, was why I'd spent $5,000 on a private investigator to document every one of Jason's outstanding debts and legal troubles. Why I'd made sure the bank had that information weeks before the auction. Security escorted Jason away as the auctioneer finalized my winning bid. The gavel fell at $275,000, nearly $275,000, nearly $100,000 below market value. The bank representative handed me a thick envelope containing the keys and title documents. "Congratulations, Mr. Wright," she said with professional detachment. "The property is yours." I waited until the crowd dispersed before approaching my father, who hadn't moved from his spot near the door. Up close, he looked decades older. Deep grooves framing his mouth, his once bright mechanic's eyes gone dull. "You played this well," he said quietly. "I didn't think you had it in you." The backhanded compliment stung more than outright anger would have. "It wasn't about playing anything, Dad. It was about saving what mattered." He studied the cracked pavement. "Jason's in rehab. 3rd time this year." A pause. "He asked about you." I thought of all the times I'd covered for Jason's benders, made excuses for his absences, lied to customers about why their repairs took so long. The memories tasted bitter. "Tell him." I hesitated, then shook my head. Never mind, he wouldn't listen anyway. I turned toward my truck, but my father's voice stopped me. "You kept the name." On the building behind him, workers were already removing the plywood from the windows, revealing the freshly repainted sign, Wright Automotive. The & Sons was conspicuously absent. "I kept what was worth keeping," I said, and left him standing there. The renovations took 6 brutal months. We gutted the original structure down to its bones, exposing decades of patch jobs and quick fixes beneath the surface. The crew found my grandfather's original tools buried under a pile of moldy rags in the back office. Perfectly preserved, just waiting to be used again. Jessica and I designed the new shop exactly how we'd always dreamed. State-of-the-art lifts, a computerized diagnostic bay, even a comfortable waiting area that didn't smell like stale cigarettes. Every decision felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. Our grand reopening coincided with the first warm day of spring. I'd expected maybe 50 people. By 10 a.m., the parking lot was overflowing, the line stretching around the block. Local news crews showed up when the mayor arrived to cut the ribbon. Mr. Kowalski brought a 6-pack of the cheap beer my grandfather used to drink, and insisted we crack one open for tradition. I was explaining our new maintenance tracking system to a group of interested customers when I noticed my father standing near the back. He wore his old Wright & Sons coveralls, the name patch frayed but still visible. Our eyes met across the crowded service bay, and for the first time in years he smiled. Just a small quirk of his lips, but unmistakable. He left before I could speak to him. But the next morning I arrived to find a package on my desk. My grandfather's original shop manual from 1947. Its pages filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Tucked inside was a faded photograph. My grandfather standing proudly in front of the newly opened shop. My father, maybe 10 years old at the time, beaming beside him, both holding wrenches like sacred objects. Underneath in my father's shaky handwriting, first lesson. It's never about the cars. It's about the hands that fix them. I ran my fingers over the words, remembering the first time he'd said that to me. I'd been 7 years old, struggling to loosen a bolt, frustrated to the point of tears. He'd knelt beside me, placed his hands over mine, and guided my movements. "Feel it, Danny," he'd whispered. "The metal talking to you." The shop phone rang, jolting me back to the present. Another customer, another repair, another day. I placed the photo on my office wall where I could see it from my desk. Not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what I'd fought to preserve. Outside, the sounds of my thriving business carried through the open door. The hum of machinery, Jessica laughing with a customer, the familiar clang of tools against metal. The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went out to greet them. The new generation of Wright Automotive. My legacy now. The first anniversary of Wright Automotive's reopening arrived with a snowstorm that silenced the city. I stood at the garage doors watching the flakes swirl under the security lights, my breath fogging the glass. The shop hummed around me, the new heating system keeping the space comfortably warm while outside. 12 inches of fresh powder buried the memories of that crumbling gas station where I'd started over. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. I knew before answering who it would be. Hospitals never call at decent hours with good news. "Mr. Wright, your father's had a stroke." The roads were impassable, but I made it to County General in 20 minutes flat, my truck fishtailing through intersections. The ER nurse recognized me immediately. She'd been a regular at Wright & Sons. "He's stable," she said, guiding me through the maze of curtained bays. "But there's other complications." My father looked small in the hospital bed, his right side slack, his breathing assisted by tubes. What shocked me more than his physical state was seeing Jason already there, sober for once, slumped in the plastic chair beside the bed. We hadn't spoken since the auction. The doctor's prognosis was blunt. Massive ischemic event. He'll need months of rehab, possibly full-time care afterward. She hesitated. "Your brother mentioned something about family property that could cover expenses." Jason's head snapped up. I saw the calculation in his bloodshot eyes. The same look he'd get when figuring which customer to overcharge next. I stepped between them. "We'll discuss finances privately." When the doctor left, Jason grabbed my arm. "That property's half mine, Danny. Dad never changed the will." I shook him off. "The shop's in my name. Always has been." "Bullshit. Grandpa left it to Dad, which means nothing," I said quietly, pulling folded papers from my jacket. "Because Dad signed over his rights when he sold me the business. You'd know that if you'd ever read a contract in your life." Jason's face contorted. For a terrible moment, I thought he might strike me right there in the hospital room. Then his shoulders sagged and he collapsed back into the chair. "What am I supposed to do? I'm broke, Danny. I got nothing." The raw desperation in his voice startled me. This wasn't the Jason who'd swaggered through life expecting handouts. This was a broken man staring down his own mortality. I made my decision right then, though it would take weeks to sort out the details. The solution came to me as I drove back through the snow at dawn, past our old neighborhood where the streetlights still flickered like they had when we were kids racing our bikes home before dark. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. By afternoon, we'd drawn up papers creating the Robert Wright Foundation. a nonprofit vocational school for at-risk youth housed in the original Wright and Sons building. My father would have a place there as honored instructor emeritus when he recovered. Jason. Jason would get one final chance as facilities manager, with strict sobriety requirements and weekly oversight. Jessica called it my monumentally stupid generous streak. Mr. Kowalski toasted me with cheap beer and said Grandpa would have approved. But it was my father's reaction when I explained the plan that undid me. A single tear cutting through the stubble on his paralyzed cheek as he squeezed my hand with his good one. Spring came early that year. On opening day at the foundation, I stood between my father's wheelchair and a nervous but clean Jason, cutting the ribbon for a crowd that included city officials and half our old neighborhood. Reporters asked why I'd pour money into a struggling part of town. I nodded to where my father was demonstrating proper wrench technique to a group of wide-eyed teenagers. His speech still slurred, but his hands as steady as ever. Every engine needs all its parts working together, I told them, even the ones that have been neglected. The truth was more complicated, of course. This wasn't absolution, and the scars ran too deep for that. But as I watched my father light up explaining carburetors to kids who'd never held a tool before, I realized something unexpected. I hadn't just rebuilt a business. I'd salvaged what few good pieces remained of my family, the way you'd save usable parts from a totaled car. Now when I walk through both shops, the thriving Wright Automotive with its state-of-the-art equipment, and the foundation with its laughter and occasional crashes from the student garage, I no longer see what was lost. I see what survived. The bell still jingles when the door opens at both locations. These days, I like the sound.